We're going to talk today, I want to talk a little bit about mobile security and legacy infrastructure. One of the challenges I think that is, I've grown up with the mobile side of security has been trying to figure out how best to integrate the things that people want to do in the time that they want to do it with the infrastructure that's sitting out there today. So a couple things. When I was young, I decided I wanted to be a park ranger. Then I decided I wanted to be a cowboy. Then I decided I wanted to go skiing. I actually learned how to ski. That was a lot of fun. And then finally, mountain climbing was kind of a trick. Now, here's something, actually this will put a little bit of age on that. If you notice the boots on the back of the dog, there's a little metal clip. Those were actually ski boots. But, it worked for the Photoshop. I'm going to walk through, and these slides will go fairly quickly. You probably know most of the drill around this. The first piece is that PCs are starting to shrink in terms of usage, not terribly bad, but smartphones and tablets are starting to pick up rather quickly and have over the last little while and will continue moving forward. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and this comes from the Kleiner Perkins conference a little while ago, and this is a Morgan Stanley slide, and they talk about every time we make a cycle in the industry, the number of devices sold grows by 10x. So as you can see, as we start moving into the mobile side, things are getting bigger and bigger. So the question is what else is out there? The real point of this slide is just that there are a ton of mobile devices. It's just going to continue to grow. And we need to be able to deliver services and capabilities to those devices. Operating system growth. The reason I bring this up is that I think a lot of people will focus in on one particular operating system, and I'm not sure that you can anymore. Security needs to be consistent and prevalent across all of them. The differences are that once you get into each one of those operating systems and into the platforms, the capabilities and the feature set changes. So figuring out what the lowest common denominator is becomes very, very critical in trying to figure out your security strategy in mobile. My favorite, BYOD versus corporate. The big green bar is the consumer side, which then really gets into the number of consumer devices. But notice that between the blue and the, is that teal? Teal. There's a huge growth in the BYOD space. Many companies are really starting to move forward very quickly into the BYOD place. If you notice in 2014, estimates coming out from a couple of different folks, and we combine this chart from Gartner, Forrester, and a few others, 85% of companies will allow corporate liable devices and bring your own device to work. Bring your own devices to work. 70% will furnish some level of corporate-owned device, so corporate liable devices. They're not going away. And then 57% are bringing in tablets for some of their employees. And they did that last year. So again, the numbers, this is from last year. We don't have anything new saying what's going to happen this year. But you can see those numbers are holding up. And so the device plethora of devices actually is continuing to increase and continue to grow. So you're going to have to figure out how am I going to provide that common level of security across all of these platforms. And especially with things that vary differently between BYOD and the corporate liable devices. So one of the interesting things, and the title of this particular section is that technology typically drives what people bring in or what people end up using. And when I say technology, it's not necessarily the technology that your technology teams provide. It's the technology that you want. So you start bringing it into the office and you start pushing forward with your IT department. You start pushing forward with your managers. At a company that I worked at a while back, the only reason they picked up the iPhone initially was because a very, very senior individual at that company said, I have to have an iPhone. So they started bringing it in. Nothing wrong with that, but there were no plans and they really didn't have any opportunities, so they had to take a sidestep. And that's not the only kind of activity where you see something new being introduced into the company before the IT infrastructure is ready or is capable of managing it or providing the services. In this case, you can see the current state. And really what we're trying to focus in, or what I'm trying to focus in on this is that the current environment is still very much technology driven, so it's the technology that we've got. It's not necessarily the technology that makes you most useful and most productive in your organization. We're using a lot of base technology that's been around for a very long period of time. We're not moving forward aggressively in some cases, and in other cases we are moving forward aggressively and moving in towards things like cloud and then non-base infrastructure technology. So a big piece of this is that we have been in a shift for about the last 10 years with mobile. For folks that have been around, you may remember something called the WAP gap. Everybody was excited about that. We knew that would go away, and we knew that problem would be fixed. We also knew that the form factors were going to change, and there was going to be some consolidation. It was very, very difficult, to write applications in that space, and then also try to think about how would I go about securing it. So the emerging state, we're seeing more people-driven interactions. So think about things like Facebook, Twitter, all the instant messaging applications, all the instant connections that you can build out of that space. They're also seeing things in other people's hands that allow them to have instant access to information in the corporate space. So the next question is then how can I have that, and then what can I do about it, and then how can I manage the risk associated with that? And I think this is, still gets back into the challenge. You still have a plethora of devices in your environment, and you still need to be thinking about how are you going to manage the security across those platforms and ensure that you meet the risk appetite, assuming that your company knows what their risk appetite is, and meeting their risk appetite when it comes to security for mobile. So the mobility challenges, again, smartphones, wearables. How many people have a smartwatch or some sort of wearable? Quite a few. Fitbits, anybody? No? A few? How about Samsung Galaxy Gear? How about that? Yeah, a few of you. A little plug, mercilessly plug. Think about those. Those are now starting to come into play, and some of the devices that are coming out, not only do they connect to your phone and leverage the communications channel on your phone, they also leverage their own communications channel. So how do you make sure that the infrastructure is in place to allow you to manage the devices, manage the security on the devices, the information, and then to deal with an event or an incident should that happen? And it's been fun over the last day and a half to listen to some of the hacking attacks. I always enjoy that part of a conversation. This space is so new, and I think we had a debate yesterday about IoT. Mobile is part of the IoT kind of space, and if we don't prove the technology, we don't lay the framework, we don't start building out into the infrastructure, it's great that we have standards, but if we're not building them and we're not testing them, then it becomes very, very difficult, and especially as we start getting into things like smartphones and wearables. So security is a big issue there. BYOD presents huge challenges, both from a legal perspective. Do you allow it? Can you allow it? And then from the other half of that equation is, how can I ensure that my employees, their private side of the equation is protected? So you have to think about that. And then also your corporate information and your enterprise information, what's going on in that space. Mobile apps. Social media, cloud services, whole tons of things are now showing up out there and have been for the last several years. So if you think about some of the cloud storage tools that are out there, how do you know your information isn't ending up out there? How do you enable people to be able to share information openly when it's appropriate? So there's a ton of work that has to be done in that space and has to be understood as you're building out your infrastructure and you're building out your technology approach. Product diversity, if you think about the purchases that people make, consumer smartphones initially had very little security built into them. We're starting to see more of the consumer devices contain more capability, but again, you still have to figure out how are you going to manage what's out there and then augment when they run into a deficit relative to the things that you're trying to accomplish with your security program. So key things here, security, application integration with your enterprise. And then at the last one down, there's the delivery model and governance. Again, piece that I don't want to miss, and I really don't want to pass over too much, is that we have the opportunity to do a better job of security and applications. And when things move into the mobile space, especially if you have a minimalist approach from a security perspective, you need to make sure that your applications are not going to be things that will allow people to either invade your infrastructure or to steal the data off of your phone or pull data out of your infrastructure. You need to make sure that you've got good, solid security software development capabilities built in. So mobile device security risk. I've divided this one up. You can see the constant debate, and in this case, talk about enterprise resource planning. We've also got the CRM, or customer relationship management. Some of the enterprise resource planning is pretty critical because you can see a lot about what's going on within the company. CRM, not so much, but I do know I can start looking at who your customers are. I can start looking at what your engagement practices are, your potential sales, and your potential opportunities. Asset management and logistics. So again, getting into this space, you're starting to look at what assets are available, how you're moving things around. Assets are also products that you're selling or products that you're acquiring. Critical communications, I think, a lot of the ComSec issues that we see are really starting to, we still see things like, we can hack encryption relative to the mobile airwaves. We can still get into certain systems. Well, GSM, we've known that that's been hackable for a number of years, yet there are still places that are using it. How do you know when your employees go onto an environment, or when you're having a conversation with a customer, that environment and the data that's traveling across that network is encrypted? Again, it depends upon the protocols, depends upon what you're doing. So you have to take that into consideration. Along the business value side, early on in phase one, a lot of companies started mobilizing the desktop. So think about it. A company I used to work for, BlackBerry, started off with providing you with your email and your calendaring. Those were key things that people needed. So you could get instant messaging, you could get access to your data, access to your email, and then also access to your calendar very early on. And then the next step, and I remember sitting around with a couple of us at a previous employer that was heavy use of BlackBerry, was trying to figure out, so what's next? And we started getting things like, well, the trading folks wanted to start getting, real-time ticker feeds, Bloomberg News, things of that nature. How are you going to be able to provide that? There's bandwidth issues, there's security issues, a whole host of things along those lines. So you start to mobilize the desktop. The next piece is then your core infrastructure. So if you think about this, when I talk about core infrastructure, these are some of your core applications that you're running in your enterprise. And so enterprise voice, for example, you start looking at access to things on your intranet, on the internet. How can you provide seamless and ease of use in those particular spaces? You either develop an application or hope that they run HTML. Then you've got to have the communications encryption and all the rest of that goes along with it. And then eventually, finally, you're redefining your business opportunities. One of the interesting things, and one of the things I think is sad, is not necessarily enough companies take a look at what is their business strategy for mobile. And I think you have to really set that out and lay that out, and then start to adapt your security program and your security architecture to meet those particular business requirements and business needs. So as you're building that out, you have the opportunity to go in and really redefine what it is that your business is doing. That's your overall enterprise or business strategy. And then down in there, how can security become an enabler of those things that you want to do? And then to be able to manage the risk and your risk appetite. So one of the things, and I think, having been in the consuming side of this equation at an enterprise, very much the case. I got to have this, I need this for my job, I need this for my business, how quickly can you install it? And all of a sudden you now have mobile infrastructure, not necessarily understanding what the security ramifications are, what the application ramifications are, or anything else. So very few of them jump into mobile with planning, with solid planning. This is where I want to go and this is what I want to do. This is typical of a lot of early adopters and a lot of early technology that we bring on board. And part of that is figuring out what will it do. But you also need to be thinking about how can I relate and take my business strategy and then figure out what it is that I want to do that this will really solve a business problem. And then associated with that is, can I do that securely and can I manage that efficiently and effectively? If the answers are no, you need to really take a step back and think about how you're going to really drive that forward. So it really needs to be thought about as being a business enabler. And if you think about going back to the conversation about the brokers and the dealers needing access to information quickly, if I have to go to lunch or if I have to leave for something or if I'm at a conference somewhere, instant communications can mean the difference between a little bit of money and a lot of money. So really, figuring out, is there really a strategy here? Is there really a business enabler that you need to think about? I'm not going through this. I threw this in to kind of lay this out is that your security architecture needs to be designed around your business architecture and your technology architecture. You need to look at what's going on within the business. The business and your enterprise architecture, your technology architecture really should be focusing in on being business enablers. And in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily that case. When it comes to mobile, it becomes even harder because you may not be able to make applications or services available in that space without really rethinking what's going on. You need to link that back into what can I do and how can I provide that level of security that's important for me to make that happen. Differentiation of IT products and services. again, if you've got, or differentiated, sorry, if you've got differentiated products and services, you can think about maybe you have a phased implementation plan for the products that you want to bring on board. Again, it's aligned with a strategy. The conversations as to what's priority for the business, and then building out the pieces of the tool that really make that happen. One of the challenges, and I think this is probably, from my perspective, one of the biggest issues for us in security, is the complexity. Right now, in order to implement applications and services on mobile devices, in some cases you need multiple tools. And as we know, if you've got multiple tools, you have multiple threat vectors. You've just expanded your threat vectors significantly, and you now need to think about what's that going to do to you. So how are you going to simplify that so it becomes a manageable problem rather than an unmanageable problem? And then how, from an IT perspective, are they going to be able to take advantage of the capabilities that are built in to really reduce their overhead and their burden? Otherwise, mobile starts to make no business sense, and people will start to back away from it. And then finally, down towards the bottom, there's a couple of pieces. So, operations, if your operations aren't smooth, they don't work well, your security program has problems, and your security operations centers can't manage the technology, then things start to fall apart very quickly, and your tools all of a sudden become disabled, and things will not work, and then you end up with business challenges that you see in many cases when you've got a critical system failure. And then finally, towards the bottom, there's sourcing management. I think, but probably the biggest piece down here is innovation. When we make these big moves, there's an opportunity to innovate. It used to be when we would, one of the companies that I worked for, when we would acquire a company, one of the big pieces of the equation was, what do we keep from them? What do we keep from us? How do we do the integration? Several of us used to take a step back and say, okay, so what could we do differently where we really don't need all of that and we could improve the overall infrastructure and the overall business? You've got the opportunity within this space as you're doing this and you're making those migrations, both from a business perspective as well as from a security perspective. What can I change in those infrastructures, and what can I bring in to replace a whole host of disconnected infrastructure and then drive it forward? Mobile architecture, we'll plow through this one fairly quickly. So cybersecurity trends, you know the numbers. The one I thought was kind of interesting was active threat groups, 300, which is a 4x increase over 2011. We know the increase by this, the attacks, the hacktivist nation states. I think there's some really interesting stuff with our friends with a 3-letter agency name. Out-of-the-box vulnerabilities, and again, a lot of things, and I think this is sort of a challenge for a lot of us, is that in many cases you turn on a device and it has to go through a series of updates. For that period of time, those past 0-day pieces are still there. So you have to really be able to think about that. Estimates of 80+% of the networks have been compromised. Again, the network infrastructure may have, and then the question is what data are they after? And then we're starting to see the attacks come in on the mobile platforms. I think there's a lot of effort going on in multiple places with the industry to address things. So for example, like code signing. Signed and authorized and authenticated app stores, things of that nature start to really drop it down. Does it solve hunger? No. But it starts to really change the noise dynamics and starts to reduce the overall security risks associated with the business. This gets back into one of the challenges, and we built out this particular deck, and there's a whole bunch of data that sits behind it, and we were trying to emphasize that the complexities in here introduce a lot of opportunity for increased risk. So again, if you don't think about your whole mobile environment, what is it that you really want to have access to, you're going to suboptimize your implementation. And when you do the sub-optimization, you're making decisions and you're making risk assessments, or not risk assessments, but risk decisions that if you'd thought about it and really had planned for it, you might not have had to make as you move further down the path. But if you think about it, on the outside you've got your mobile devices, and they're going to come in through one of several different efforts. They're going to come in through a VPN solution, potentially, if you've got connected platforms, you don't have any applications for it. They're going to come in through a container, with one of many of the MDM, EMM products out there. And then you've got to try and integrate in the security, so things like authentication, things like authorization. Surprisingly enough, a lot of the conversations that we've been having with people, they're not really looking at intrusion detection on those devices. But if you think about the insecure Wi-Fi networks, in some of the potential, or in some of those areas, you've got to really be thinking a lot harder about that. So the implementation model really reduces the complexity. So if you're thinking about what are those applications and services that you want to bring on board, you can then start taking a look at what are the devices and the endpoints that will support those particular applications and services. Once you've got that down, you can start taking a look at what is it that you want, how do you want them to be connected, and then what are the differences in the connection methods that you need to implement from a security perspective. And then eventually looking at how are you going to manage those policies. One of my concerns about this particular kind of an environment is that if you look at that, there are 6 pieces that fit in that you have to figure out how to manage. And those don't necessarily plug into some of your legacy environments. So you've got to start thinking about how are you going to simplify that and make it much easier to manage. Otherwise, you start to increase your risk dynamics. Then you've got to think about your data center applications and how you're going to gain access to it. Are you going to leverage third-party app source? What apps are you going to allow? How do you vet and how do you understand what those apps do and the kind of information that they cough up? So you've got both the public side of the equation as well as the private. So how do you segment that? And there are several ways of doing that, including containers as well as other applications that you can run that will do the encapsulation and keep things in the same space. And then really what it comes down to is the stuff in the backside, which is your applications, your app store, and then also your data. I pulled this one in, and again, this was not intended to be a blatant push for Samsung, but I think what we've been thinking about and what we're really trying to do, and I think this is something that we need to really consider, is that built into, a couple minutes left, 2 minutes and 49 seconds, 48, is really think about building it out on a hardware and software-based solution set so that you get maximum integrity and you leverage the hardware for those things that hardware does best, key management, or key maintenance, and then encryption, as well as validation, and then building on top of that secure infrastructure so that we understand we're working on at least a secure operating system, and then you can start to secure your applications. And again, it needs to span across all of your platforms. Oops. So important steps: develop a mobile strategy, plan and implement that mobile strategy, and then really go off and think about putting together a mobile center of excellence. And if you don't have a center of excellence model, the mobile center of excellence may not help you, but think about how you could put together other centers of excellence where you can leverage the expertise across your infrastructure to really drive a more secure and more efficient and effective component. Key security considerations. Mobile management systems will help you manage the infrastructure today. What you need to think about is how do you want to drive those forward, and what are you going to do with your mobile device management infrastructure? How do you manage the policy consistently across the things that you've got today, your legacy systems, as well as the things that are going on outside? Reduce the volumes of where your data is. How many places do you need to have your data? You get into data integrity issues as well as loss issues. Somebody's device gets stolen. If you don't have the right tools in place, then you've got problems. Implement data and application access controls. The challenge is that you need to look at device-specific things. Again, it adds additional complexity, so try and minimize that and make sure that things are going on. It's amazing how many companies do not run any kind of malware or APT detection tools or anything on their endpoint devices. Mine are secure. Vendor said they're secure. Okay, that's probably true, but the applications may not be. Be very, very thoughtful about what's going on in that space, and this is where I think we as security professionals need to help drive this and then come up with the tools that are lightweight and flexible to make sure that we minimize the impact of those. And then, again, establishing the process for reporting lost or stolen devices. I'm not going to plow through each one of these, but I think the big piece of this is, again, we need to understand up front what it is that the business really wants to do with mobile, and in many cases, they don't know. So we need to help them understand that and then start to design our security architecture around our business architecture to really make sure that the tools that we're bringing on board are flexible enough to meet that business need, and then also to address our risk appetite. If I've got a huge risk appetite, I'm going to go way down, put in containers, and we're going to do tons of authentication and all the rest of that. If I've got a lower risk appetite, I may back off on some of those other things. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully this was beneficial.